She is a professor of medicine and the director of the Duke Center for the Study of Aging and Human Development, aka the Duke Aging Center. She's also co-director of the Duke UNC Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Let's give it up for Dr. Heather Whitson.
Hi, good evening. So I'm going to tell you about why the Duke UNC Alzheimer's Disease Center is studying people who do not have Alzheimer's disease. But first, I want to ask you to think to yourself, where did you find your calling? And I'm going to tell you something that's kind of cheesy, which is that when I was in high school, this is true, I came across a quote, which was that your calling is the place where your great gladness and one of the world's great hungers meet. And so I went off to college with this sort of hope in my heart that I would find my calling. And I did. I found it at this place, which is, anybody recognize it, know it? It's the Memory Disorders Dementia Living Residence of the Palo Alto VA Hospital. So it's a place where people, veterans living with dementia, live and are cared for. And I loved it. I volunteered there, and I loved the hours that I spent there. And as a biology major, I was also really fascinated and curious by what was going on in the brains of these patients that I was interacting with. So I felt that sense of gladness. And I was also very aware that dementia rates were increasing at staggering rates. And so it felt also like a place that was probably one of the world's great hungers. But my next lesson in dementia was personal. So this is me, young me, graduating from college. This is my mom and dad, who are here tonight, as well as my 83-year-old grandmother, who had traveled from Arkansas to come and see me graduate from Stanford. And it was a great trip, full of wonderful memories, but it was also the trip when it became very clear to my family that my grandmother had dementia. And prior to that, the sort of forgetfulness and memory changes we had attributed to her age or some grief because of the loss of my grandfather, but on this trip it was clear it was something more, and shortly thereafter she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and 7 years later, by the time that she died, she was receiving 24/7 care and really didn't recognize most of the family. But the thing that I know now that I didn't know then was that the changes that had been happening in her brain had been happening for years to decades prior to that trip to California. So many of you probably know that the proteins that are associated with Alzheimer's disease are amyloid and tau, and those accumulate in and around the neurons of the brain. And even though they accumulate for several years, we think, before the cognitive symptoms often manifest in most people, but now we know that even before that, the way that the brain metabolizes energy changes. We know that years and decades before that, it seems like there are activations and changes in the immune cells of the brain, the microglia, the astrocytes, and also in the vasculature of the brain that seem to precede that. So increasingly, it's become clear that we're all born with a certain genetic propensity for Alzheimer's disease. In fact, most of you might know that the gene that's most associated with risk of Alzheimer's disease is the ApoE gene, a single locus. And that link between the ApoE gene and Alzheimer's disease was actually discovered here in the Research Triangle. So it was somebody named Alan Rosas, who was a professor at Duke and also worked at GSK. So we know that you're born with that gene, and now we know hundreds of others that are implicated as well. But for most people, you live 6, 7, 8 decades before the disease manifests. So we're very interested in what happens in this period of time between when you're born. What's the role of comorbidities, things like high blood pressure, obesity, even vision and hearing loss that have been linked to your risk of Alzheimer's disease? What's the risk of biological aging? And by that I mean those molecular and cellular changes that happen with time and occur in every cell of the body, affecting the function of every tissue. And then what about exposures and lifestyle choices like diet and exercise, and exposures like environmental toxins, pathogens that we know activate our immune system, and more chronic exposures that activate our immune system like poverty, racism. So we're very interested in these questions, and we think these questions are the next era of Alzheimer's disease research because it's where so many opportunities are to intervene before the amyloid and tau and before the symptoms of memory loss. But there are some big problems with the current evidence base. So one big problem is that most of the studies that have previously studied Alzheimer's disease have enrolled people who had Alzheimer's disease. Now that's not that surprising, right? If you wanted to study Alzheimer's disease, you'd go out and enroll people that have Alzheimer's disease, and maybe some controls who are age-matched peers that don't have the disease. But the problem is that study population misses those opportunities to understand what's going on with the disease in the years before it's obvious that the person has it. And most of the studies on Alzheimer's disease have enrolled people who were highly educated, socioeconomically advantaged, and white. And in fact, of the landmark clinical trials lately that have been in studying and giving to people drugs that are possibly beneficial for Alzheimer's disease, 96% of the study population has been non-Hispanic white. That's pretty disgraceful when we think about the fact that Black and Latino populations in America actually bear a disproportionate burden of the disease, higher prevalence rates. So in the Duke UNC Alzheimer's Disease Center, we want to study Alzheimer's disease in new ways. One thing that we want to do is to recruit a population of our own and also to conduct and support research that is inclusive of all of us and representative of the diversity of our state. We also want to enroll people who are younger people who don't yet have Alzheimer's disease, but have a family history of it. So we're a big center. We were just funded by the NIH. We received designation as a federally funded center. Today, to the date, this is our 1-year anniversary. So happy birthday to us. Thank you. And we're a lucky state because we're actually, Wake Forest has one too. So now we have Duke, UNC, and Wake Forest together. We have 2 funded Alzheimer's disease research centers. We are big. I run this center with my co-director at UNC, who is Gwen Garden. She's a neurologist, the chair of neurology there, and we also represent dozens of faculty researchers at Duke, UNC Chapel Hill, and our 3 partner schools, which are NCCU, North Carolina Central University, ECU, and UNC Pembroke. Our goal is to provide the NIH, which receives data from all of these funded centers across the country. Our goal is to provide data that is different than the other data that they're getting from some of the other centers. We want people who are younger and more diverse. We are specifically focused on Black communities in North Carolina, Native American or American Indian, particularly the Lumbee tribe, and people from rural North Carolina. All of these groups very underrepresented. We're recruiting people as young as age 25, and at age 45, we start following people every year to let them know more information about their risk of Alzheimer's disease, and if in fact they may be showing some early symptoms of it, and also so that we can start understanding when that happens. We're particularly interested in perimenopausal women, since that's one of those metabolic changes that has been associated with some of those changes that may precede the disease. And we're collecting a lot of novel biomarkers to try to understand more about the disease. We're shooting for 500 people in the first 5 years. We currently have 84. Not bad for a pandemic year. So we are also sort of taking the show on the road, as it were. We're going out into eastern North Carolina, our catchment area. We're doing public awareness, we're doing educational events, really trying to show people, again, starting at very early ages, the importance of brain health, and also to start to talk about the importance of being in the research that can make you both a beneficiary of the research and also a contributor for future generations. We're also very committed to hiring and training a next generation of research workers that will also be more diverse and reflective of the state. So I will say that I am delighted to have found my calling, and even more delighted to now work in a center where I think for most of us, it's way more than a job. It's a calling to protect brain health.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Whitson. Questions? Oh, I see a lot of hands over here. Okay. We'll start right here.
Hi, so I was just wondering if there were any ethical dilemmas with having people that don't show any signs of Alzheimer's in the studies, where maybe they might not want to know that they are at risk of Alzheimer's, and the ethical dilemma of you figuring out that potentially they have a risk of Alzheimer's. Do you tell them or do you not tell them, depending on what they want, and that dilemma basically.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great question about the ethical concerns of letting people know their risk of Alzheimer's disease when right now we don't have a cure to offer. And so it is an opt-in. People can tell us whether they want to know or they don't want to know. And in the old days of Alzheimer's disease research, it used to be sort of the recommended thing that you didn't tell people, partly because the thinking was that telling people might change their behavior on the cognitive exams and things like that. We feel quite the opposite, that if people are going to be in our study, they've partnered with us. If they want to know, they can know anything that we know. But you're right, some people choose not to know. But I think in the days of, 23andMe and Ancestry.com, a lot of us are getting a lot of information about our health. So,
Thank you. I really appreciate your talk and input. Has your research showed that dementia and Alzheimer's is hereditary?
yeah, so there's certainly a family connection. Both we know certain genes that are associated with the risk of Alzheimer's disease, and then even aside from genetics, there is also people who don't have some of those known genetic factors. It still seems, if you have family members that had Alzheimer's disease or other related dementias, there's a higher risk, and we don't know if some of that has to do with maybe like early life exposures, but there are certainly genes as well that are connected.
One more question right here.
Hi, so how early does the amyloid plaque buildup starts, and how soon do you have to start the intervention in order to deter or alert or stop dementia or Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah, I think the question was how early do you have to start to stop the disease? So we don't have any proven therapies yet. It's actually Alzheimer's disease is the only one of the top 10 diseases in this country associated with death that doesn't have a proven prevention or cure. But what we think is that if we are likely to find interventions, it's probably, like I said, years to decades before the person develops symptoms. Now there's the trick. Not everybody develops symptoms at the same time. Because we think that it's so heterogeneous what people experience through their lifetime that contributes to opening the door to this disease. So the way that I think of it is you're born with some sort of genetic propensity, but clearly throughout the lifespan. So for example, if you're exposed to additional stressors that cause a lot of activation in your immune system, if your gut microbiome changes because of changes in diet, there's increasing evidence that it changes this sort of gut-brain axis and signals to the brain and the nutrients that the brain has to metabolize, which then also affect its ability to clear or produce amyloid. So there are so many things that affect the development of this disease that I think we've long given up the idea that there is like a single smoking gun cause. So the good news is that means you can start as early as you want to. You're probably preventing it right now if you make a healthy choice.
Thank you so much. I know we're a little bit out of time, but thank you. Fascinating.